Olá, colegas, pessoal que acho que já entrou aqui na página ou que já começou a assistir pelo Facebook. Meu nome é Rafael, sou da Bucareste Ateliê de Cinema. Dou um breve e rápido olá aqui a todos.
Olá,
Olá, Pierre,
tudo
já está
bom?
conosco. E vou passar a palavra já para a Bruna, que vai fazer a mediação desse primeiro webinar voltado para a ótica com nosso colega Alex Nelson, da Zerø Optik. Bruna, contigo.
Oi, oi. É, Sejam todos muito bem-vindos. Para quem não sabe, a gente vai estar falando inglês por conta do Alex, mas posteriormente tudo que falar que vai ser falado aqui vai ser legendado para português, vai estar disponível para quem quiser assistir depois. Como o Rafa já falou, esse webinar é uma realização da Bucareste em parceria com a ACASP. E é isso, vamos começar. Hi, Gabriel. Hi, Alex. Hi,
Hello.
Pierre. Nice to
Hello.
meet you. Really nice to have you here. And I welcome everyone to this Bucharest webinar. I'm Bruna. I'm focus puller. And I'm joined by Alex Nelson from Zerø Optik, Pierre Kerchove, DOP, and Gabriel Bemergui, businessman and vintage lens owner. Thanks to Bucharest and ACASP to make this happen. And thanks to all of you for being here. I guess we can get right into it. So we are going to start asking you guys about your own stories. How did your relationship with vintage lenses begin? And I would like to start by hearing from Alex. How did you get here? How did Zerø Optik get started? Please share your experience with us.
Thank you so much for having me, by the way. I actually went to film school. I'm not a formally trained engineer. I didn't study how to build lenses. I didn't study engineering. I went to school for cinematography and worked in New York as a camera assistant. I worked at rental houses. And several years ago, I moved to Los Angeles and worked with Duclos Lenses as their chief engineer, which is really when I started focusing on building lenses and seeing mechanically sort of what was involved in taking old lenses and sort of forgotten lenses and finding a way to bring them to cinematographers. The vault at Duclos is filled with decades of cinema lenses going back to the 1920s, the 1930s. And so as I started to work on rehousings, I could go into that vault and see how engineers had tackled different mechanical problems over the last 80 years, and see how Cook managed to overcome certain challenges, or Ingenue or Zeiss, and essentially use that experience to sort of pick and choose what sort of mechanisms and what sort of decisions we'd make for the Zerø Optik lenses. It wasn't something that Duclos really wanted to get involved in. They focused more on service and new products. And so I was able to continue my work there doing like mount modifications and new product design while doing the rehousing on the side. And then about 3 or 4 years ago, I left Duclos to work on Zerø Optik full time. And since then, we've really just been building up our inventory of different projects and working with different directors and cinematographers to realize some really unique stuff, because I never wanted to just be sort of the North American version of TLS or PNS Technic or some of the other rehousing companies. I wanted to offer something unique to filmmakers that you couldn't otherwise get. We've built lenses now for 65 millimeter film cameras. We've built lenses for VistaVision bodies. Our first product was a pinhole lens for cinematography. So there's very much a focus on interesting sort of creative tools rather than simple rehousing.
Sorry, I was muted. Nice. So Pierre, do you want to introduce yourself? Muted. You're muted.
Yes, hi everybody. Nice to meet you, Alex. Bruna also, we haven't met before. Gabriel, I know from many jobs, because Gabriel is also an enthusiastic about vintage lenses, and so am I. I guess for me the vintage lens thing started right with the start when with the digital cameras. When when the Alexa, when Red, when the market went all digital, it's when we felt that need to start to have an identity for our images, because they were starting to look all the same. Because back in the day with stock, when film, we could do stuff on the process and push stops and do things to try to find a different perspective to the image, a different quality to it. And when we start all shooting on digital, that's when we felt that it's weird, because on the film I felt that it was always try to work with the best lenses, technically speaking, to have the most accurate, sharp lenses. It was a different set of mind. And then when with digital, we kind of went backwards. I feel that we try to find a way to get that image to have more personality to the image, because it's not enough what you can do in post-production. I mean, you need to be able to be on the set and see already what's going to, to feel the image already. I for myself, that's how I work. I like to leave the set feeling that I have done that. If I didn't do some coloring grading afterwards, I would be happy with the image that I did on that day, just by leaving the set, So that's why I think that's where the vintage lenses come in for you to give some personality to your image. And that's something that, and that's a little bit where that's interesting to hear you speaking, Alex, because for sometimes when we take lenses like, and let's say the master primes, the spherical ones, we feel it's completely done by engineers because it's so perfect technically, but it's kind of soulless in a way. We feel that where's the person who elaborate this lens didn't really thought about that the defects, the let's say all the I have a lack of words, but the artifacts, they're not defects. Sometimes they really come handy just for this, not just for the beauty of it, but also for the story that you want to tell. So at the same time, with digital, that you have an instant image of what it's going to look. It's also, you can also, you don't in film before, you got some surprises after when you were doing the scans and the grading. You say, oh, look at that flare, it's looking great, and stuff like that. Now with digital, you see right on the spot. So it's a different approach. There is I feel there's a big revolution in that sense. And that's, I think, what cinematographers are looking for. It's really to expand their bucket of tools and to be able to play with the largest amount of different flares, glares, or not to have glares or not so much. And I think that there's not only the glasses, but sometimes also a very old coating. It's like a good wine, it ages well, with time, and and you cannot reproduce that on a new lens, and it has to be that old one in a way. So it's very organic in a way also. I think it's something that has been happening for the past, let's say, 8, 10, I don't know, less than 10 years ago. And it's I don't, and now with the large format, it's another horizon that spreads itself to us, because that's what you just told about VistaVision lenses. Now we have all the medium format lenses that we can try to bring to movies. So there's a big blend of stuff going on, and it's very exciting times, I think, in a way. That's what I have to say.
Nice, thank you, Pierre. And Gabriel, if you can bring some national perspective of all this scenario and your relationship with the vintage lenses, how it began. You are muted. Sorry. Gabriel, 1 minute. We need, yes.
And now, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes,
okay.
yes.
I think I already got in contact with Alex some weeks ago regarding something. Yeah, he may remember. Pierre is a great friend. He helped me a lot with the lenses here in Brazil, because it's a kind of try and error when you choose vintage lenses. So I began my company here in Brazil as a still photography rental company. So I just started renting Hasselblads and Profoto strobes and equipment for still photography. I started renting the 5D camera, and then when I saw I was renting equipment for movies and video shootings. So then I started growing with the Cooks and Master Primes and all the standard lenses that we had been using in the last 20 years. But I felt something like 5 years ago in Brazil, it's not the same time frame as United States, because the United States, the culture of the option from vintage lenses, it's older than Brazil. The lenses are more popular there than here, but here, and then I tried to search something, but I had no knowledge about nothing. It's just I got a set of JDC lenses. Funny is the lenses I offered to Alex to something some days ago, some weeks ago, and then when I got that lenses, I said, okay, these lenses are legendary, but what I will do with that lenses, what I can do with that, because I don't know how to service, I don't know what the image they provide you, I don't know what's inside. So I started trying to fix the lenses and started buying all the different glasses, like the Ultra Scopes, Scopes, and Cook Van Diemen's, Todieos, Senior Visions, and a lot of lenses. So after that, we have been renting the vintage lenses for something like 5 years. And when I told I was finished the collection, we started seeing a lot of glasses, mostly from the original full frame still cameras, like the lenses that Alex performed the rehousing, and it opened a new huge range of lenses that now can be used with the cameras, because it's a technical question I will ask you later about the camera flange. But that's a story. I started just digging and learning it by myself. It's a very complicated work because the lenses are fragile and it demands a lot of work. But now we are happy about what we have here in Brazil, because we have at last the standards. We have the K35s, the spherical Kowas, the S3 lenses, the Cinevisions, but I think that we have another 10 years exploring, at last 10 years exploring full frame lenses and even large format lenses for the vintage market, because it's a kind of lens that, in my opinion, will not go away. It will always be an option, like the standard spherical and modern lenses, like the anamorphic lenses. So, but I can say you that Brazil market have something like the share market for the vintage lenses in Brazil is around 15% of the project, maybe 10, but between 10 to 15, I think that's the proportion when you choose the vintage lens, mostly because the sets are short, so you can shoot big projects with 5 or 6 lenses actually. But that's it. That's the story. We're still digging and we're still learning, and yeah, here to understand more with the master here. That's it.
Nice, thank you. I was thinking about this relationship between digital cinema and the rehousing industry growth that you bring, and Pierre as well. So maybe if Alex want to bring something about this and this large format thing, and we have the new mount LPL of ARRI as well. So all these kind of new things that is helping this movement of the rehousing and vintage lenses, and maybe tell us about how this relationship works. I mean, in this scenario of the rehouse companies and the big rentals house in US for you and Zerø Optik.
Yeah, it's the move to full frame sensors is actually it's been really exciting for us because you know, I think the first sort of vintage lens sets that a lot of people, at least in the US, had experience with were the Cookspeed Panchros, because you still had, you know, most, if not all, digital cinema cameras at the time were still Super 35 format. And so if you wanted, you know, a decent range of focal lengths, you had to work with pre-existing cinema lens sets, like the Panchros, eventually the Super Baltars. And you have some rarer lenses out there like the Canoptics, but it was still a pretty limited pool to draw from. And once full frame sensors became more widely used and more popular, that really opened up a whole new universe, a much broader universe of lenses that we could use all of a sudden. Because full frame lenses have been produced since the late 1800s. The format dates back to the 30s, but you've got stuff that sort of works in that range of focal lengths going back a really, really long way. And I mean, still photography is just a much bigger market. So from manufacturers like Canon or Leica or Nikon or Zeiss, you have a much wider variety of lenses from different eras. You could use old uncoated Leica rangefinder lenses from the 30s and 40s, or you could use really modern Leica stuff from the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s. And so we're sort of one of the younger rehousing companies, but we really hit our stride just as full frame cinema became a thing and became really popular. And it gave us a huge boost because it allowed us to enter this new market at the same time as all of our competition. And it's brought a lot of cinematographers to us who might not have wanted to shoot with Super Baltars or Panchros, but they have, you know, a set of vintage Nikons that they've always shot with. They shot stills with them. They've tortured their camera assistants by putting plastic gears and EF mounts on them. And suddenly that sort of thing can be used properly and can be used precisely on set. And so we've gotten a huge boost in requests for lenses from every sort of corner of the still photography world. vintage Minolta stuff, old Canon rangefinder glass from the 1960s. And so that's really been exciting. And we've tried to develop a rehousing system that allows us to accommodate as many of those requests as sort of painlessly as possible. Because, you know, if we have to do everything from scratch, then it presents this huge hurdle to getting interesting lenses to clients. Where the way we built it, if someone sent us, like we had a few cinematographers from France who really loved this old Minolta 58 millimeter f1.2 lens. And it's a really unique piece of glass. And we were able to fit that into stuff that we'd already designed for Nikon and Leica with just a handful of new parts. And we've been trying more and more to get to a place where we have stuff on the shelf that will let us build virtually anything, so that there are fewer and fewer hurdles to really interesting and unique projects. With big rental houses, they're not really so much, they're not the more interesting clients for us, to be honest. Cinematographers usually bring us the most interesting sort of requests, followed by small rental houses, because they usually have to be a little bit more aggressive in what they pick for their inventory, where the big rental houses kind of follow what they know is in demand. So if enough people decide that Canon FDs or K35s are really interesting, then the big rental houses will order those things. But really, it's the people working on set who have the cool ideas, and then that sort of trickles down to companies. New mounts haven't really brought much in the way of sort of interesting options to us. LPL mount, for example, doesn't give us a lot of new room to play with. The difference between that and PL mount is only about 8 millimeters. So we still have to design things for PL mount, and then we can offer LPL if someone really wants that. Something like the new RF mount, though, is kind of exciting, because that opens up a whole realm of lenses that wouldn't fit into a PL mount. Because it's much, much closer to the sensor, you can use vintage rangefinder glass from 80 years ago, and that's something that wouldn't otherwise be possible. And you suddenly have a full set of lenses from we're usually about 19 to 25 millimeters, all the way up to 135. And that gives you a whole new range of looks that certainly modern glass can't touch. But even, SLR, reflex cameras were only widely available in the late 50s and 60s. So the oldest full frame lenses date back to the 20s and 30s, and that's suddenly available to us for rehousing, which to me, that's the most exciting thing about some of the new mounts.
Really nice. Thank you, Alex. Pierre and Gabriel, we can have a free conversation here. If you have something to ask to Alex.
Yeah. I have a lot of
Don't
questions.
wait for me.
Yeah. Hey, Alex. So there's one interesting question that I have I haven't thought about that for the last 10 years. Yeah. Because if you got a 44, a shorter flange lens that can be used by the LPL mounts, okay? But I saw some lenses like that being used with the normal PL mount. So how is possible? How is possible to have some shorter lens with a longer and a shorter PL flange distance, the same lens that's originally built to be used on 44? How can you do that to be acceptable on 52?
It's tricky. It sort of has to be evaluated from one lens to the next. The very first project we did were the original Baltars, which were developed in the late 30s, before there were reflex systems on movie cameras. And the widest lens in that set is a 25 millimeter lens that only sits about that far from the film plane or the sensor. But if it's small enough, it's about this size, so it's pretty tiny. If it's small enough, you can fit it pretty deep into the camera, and just sort of try to squeeze all of the mechanical parts also back through the PL mount to make everything work properly. It requires a little bit of creative engineering, and there are some lenses where it just doesn't fit. Like we did last year, we built the Canon Dream Lens, the sort of famous 50 millimeter f.95, and that not only sits very close to the sensor, but it also has an enormous front optical group. And more than anything else, that's what prevented it from fitting into a PL mount. So RF mount wasn't widely available yet or widely used, so we ended up building those into Leica M, because you could buy a really solid positive lock M mount for Alexa, for Venice, for Monstro. And that allowed us to offer sort of the full range of those vintage Canon rangefinder lenses. But for some stuff, we can still fit it into a PL mount. It depends how small the optics really are.
So it doesn't apply to all lenses. It can be done with some lenses. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Yeah. That's pretty nice, because it's weird because some lenses you can do and some lenses you can't do that. Yeah. It's curious to show it as small lenses. I have one like that here. It's Lomo 20 millimeters 5.6 Russar. Yeah, it's a pretty small lenses. It's a copy of Leica lenses. In this piece was used, I don't know if you saw, I don't know about Pierre and Bruna, if you saw the Bread for Young show called When You See Us. Did you saw that TV show, someone here?
Yeah.
I saw it.
And it's interesting because we started searching for the lenses used in that project. We discovered that he used the Mero lenses, and that's M. It's for everyone, the Mero lenses is a kind of Leica M lens. Mix it with cylindric front, probably by a Shiga or a Cinevision mid-range one, to have that. It's a very interesting look, but at the same shooting, he used this one. Yeah, the small Lomo that have a beautiful chromatic aberration on the corners. It's something like pink. It's very beautiful. So I recommend everyone to see this show, because he mixed spherical vintage lenses with the anamorphic vintage lenses also, to have this kind of achievement. I don't know if that's correct. So it's a full frame lens. Yeah, it's pretty small. It's like a Zippo lighter. Yeah, that's it. That's it. Yeah. So that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, some of it is, it's always been sort of my approach that pretty much anything can be rehoused. It just matters what the important sort of parameters or specifications are. If you can use any mount and the front diameter can be any size, then anything is possible. It's when you start saying, well, it has to be PL mount, or it has to have a 95 millimeter front, or it has to have a certain kind of focus mechanism. That's when you have to get creative, or that's when certain things simply don't work. But if there's some flexibility there, then pretty much anything is possible. We had a director approach us last year who wanted to use a vintage X-ray lens. It's a 50 millimeter f.75, sort of like the Kubrick lens. And the sort of trick is the rear element has to sit within about 3 millimeters of the sensor. And if you're familiar with the way a lot of digital cameras work, you have the sensor, but there's also a piece of glass right in front of it that it has a few things. It has like an infrared filter. It has a low pass filter that keeps sort of harsh details from overwhelming the sensor. But it usually sits about 3 millimeters from the actual sensor, which meant that this lens couldn't hit infinity. But in talking to the director, he didn't need it to hit infinity. It's a portrait lens, basically. So as long as you can shoot it about 6 feet or so, that's all he wanted. And there's no room for an iris, but you wouldn't use a 0.75 lens stop down to a 2. So once you start getting rid of some of those restrictions, suddenly it becomes possible to rehouse it, because if you can say it'll fit into a Sony E mount, it doesn't need to hit infinity, and it doesn't need an iris, then we can do that really easily.
No, that's really, I've used now, right before the pandemic, I was on a feature film here in Brazil, and I've used the Petzval, the Lomo Petzval adapted by TLS, and they existed before, because Lomo reissued them for still photography, but now to see them, to be able to play with them on a film, and to have all that bouquet, it's a new era kind of thing that's arriving to us, because it's off the books that we were used to, and now it's a completely new playground. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about anamorphics, because this is going to be really new, to have anamorphics on full frame sensors or large format sensors. Will you be able to rehouse all anamorphics, or it has to be something completely new, or how is it going to work? I know Cook is doing something, and then it's going to put so much image into that sensor because of the anamorphic element. So we're going to have a splendid image, I guess. But I haven't seen anything online yet, so I don't know if you can tell us a little bit about that. Would be great.
It's something we're examining. We don't offer any anamorphic lenses yet, but a director actually approached us recently about doing 1.3, less for full frame and more for 16 for a project he has coming up. But it's sort of an exciting realm of lenses to get into, because especially with full frame, I mean, you no longer need an anamorphic lens to use, to get the most out of a film negative. It's simply for the aesthetic now, which gives us so much freedom, because you don't need to get a perfect image out of it. You can sort of mix and match things. And so for us, it's more a matter of just getting to a place where we can reliably build things efficiently, because vintage Lomo anamorphics, for example, are notoriously sort of inconsistent in their mechanical design, in their dimensions. And so finding a way to take beautiful glass like that and rehouse it in a way that doesn't mean making brand new parts every time we make a new lens is sort of tricky. But yeah, I'm excited to play with things like vintage Leica glass, vintage Canon stuff, because those combinations, you see a little bit of that when you look at old Cineo Visions or old Todd AO lenses. They would take still photography glass from that era and put Shiga fronts in front of it, or cylinders that they source from all over the place. And to sort of add to that tradition is really exciting.
Okay. And what happened? Gabriel has a set of Kowa Prominars, the spherical ones, that they're only made for a Super 35 sensor. So I don't. Is it possible to readapt that for large format? Because we saw about the K35s, the Canon K35s. They made a huge success in the past years, and then they discovered that they can be easily adapted to full frame sensors. But it is not that because they were still photography lenses back in the day that were adapted for cinema, so they kept that singularity of being able to cover a full frame. But what happens to the other nice lenses like the Cooke S3 or that were made for film, for Super 35 sensors? can we adapt them to large format? Can we, or is it easy, or does it take a lot of new glass, or
there's usually a limitation. There are some happy accidents with a lot of those vintage sets where usually somewhere around 40 millimeters, they actually just inherently start to cover full frame. But anything wider than that, you would have to develop a new design, because there just isn't enough of an image circle. You could try to put an expander behind something, but you'd end up with an incredibly slow lens that would also mimic one of the longer focal lengths in the set. If you put an expander behind, say, the 18 millimeter Coke S3, you would make the image circle bigger, but it's an extender, so you would turn it into, say, a 35 or a 40 anyway. It would just be an incredibly slow 40. But with the Cinepromenars, for example, the spherical koas, the 40 and up will cover full frame. So if you wanted to make full frame anamorphics from those, all you'd have to do is put big enough cylinders in the front that actually allow for that image circle to be used. Because the big issue with the anamorphic koas is they use incredibly tiny cylinders, which is why if you use the 40 anamorphic koa, you usually get a lot of distortion on the sides. All they needed to do was use bigger cylinders, and you'd end up with less distortion, but you'd also end up with a much bigger lens. So it would more closely approximate the anamorphic LOMOs, fairly large, like 136 millimeter fronts. But yeah, something like that would be doable. It's just a matter of finding out sort of what the native image circle is and making sure that you don't get in the way of that.
May I have a question? Yeah. Regarding the colors and the dubs that Pierre shared with us, I saw that the biggest we are talking about full frames now, but the problem is that we need to use full frame lenses to anamorphize it properly. So at least to have the wide angles, that's important, because when you have a larger sensor, the funniest thing is to have the wide angles. So, but if to use full frame or even medium format lens for the still photography, the lenses are normally low. And I have like 3 Kowa SRE sets and 3 Kowa 6x6 sets. I have been purchasing that kind of lens for the last 4 years to build some sets, but I have the problem of the speed. But I saw a manufacturer in China. They are making some lenses for the what's the name of the camera? The Fuji GFX. It's a medium format digital camera. It's a very interesting camera because it's like a Canon 1D. It's a big camera, but it seems to be a Super 35. And they have the Japanese lens from Fuji. It's not those are not cheap lenses, but there are some guys in China doing the same lenses, but with something like a lens with 82 circle. Okay, it's a big lens. So with 0.9 speed. So how is that possible? Is it a master engineering, or is it the kind of the glass melting that allow you to do that? Is it some kind of synthetic glass? What they are doing to do this miracle? Yeah, that's the question. Yeah.
It's a combination of things, because it's essentially a lot of technological advancements all coming together at the same time. So like the GFX, for example, it's not quite medium format, but it's bigger than full frame. And the flange depth is very, very short. So the closer you can get the glass to the sensor, the easier it is to make a very fast, high-performing lens. And at the same time, optical fabrication technology and optical design is being broadly computerized. So you can with a few parameters essentially get a program to figure out all the hard work for you as far as how to make a very fast, a 0.95 lens for a big sensor, where back in the day, back in the, the 50s, you would have a lot of guys with notebooks and slide rules trying to do all of the ray tracing by hand. And so they couldn't do very complex designs without putting a lot of time and a lot of work into it. Now, the materials are cheaper, the process is faster, and if you don't have to worry about a mirror in the way, then the world is sort of your oyster. Most medium format systems up till this point, if they shoot on film, you have usually a very large mirror that you have to accommodate. And once that's out of the way, once you can get the glass within 8 millimeters of the film plane, there are so many more options for you. So you don't have to worry about having very, I think with a lot of medium format systems, film systems, you might have like a fast like f2, f2.8 that's like a normal lens, like an 80 millimeter for that format. And as soon as you go any wider than that, they become f4 or 3.5.
Yeah, that's the problem. Yeah. Because the colors, the big colors are beautiful. I think that they are more conservative lenses. You need to do some adjustments, some new coatings. Maybe you can do that. But the point is, what's inside the Idna high-speed lenses? Yeah, that's a curious question. Maybe you know, or can you can, I know, maybe you can send us a tip or something like that.
There are some that I know to be Canon FDs, but obviously they're quite secretive about what's in there, and they haven't told me. It's just examining them at trade shows or at like an open house at ARRI. There are some design features in the glass that give away what's inside, either because of the coating, or there's a 55 in the set that has a static rear element. So the rear element doesn't move, but everything else does. And that was a design that only Canon did. And so it's pretty obvious that that's a Canon FD 55 millimeter. But yeah, they've tried to sort of cover their tracks in other, with some of the other focal lengths. So it can be hard to tell.
Gabriel, you are muted.
It's funny because it's a mystery. Yeah, what's inside? Everyone is doing that in the world. Yeah. You design your project, but you don't say what's inside. And it's funny because if the lenses are beautiful, the lenses are beautiful. It's fine. Yeah, you don't need to trust one in a specific brand. Yeah, you need to trust on what's more more well suited to your project. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I think it is interesting or important for rental houses and cinematographers alike to, I guess, place less importance on the individual brands and more on what the glass actually does. Because I think like the Leica R's, for example, are sort of a strange set, and I don't think they would be as popular if they didn't say Leica on them. Some of the wide focal lengths in that set were made by Minolta, by Zeiss, by Schneider, and they were just rebranded as Leica. So if you remove that sort of premium branding from it, I don't think they would be as popular. I don't think as many people would see the magic in them. Where if you can essentially give people a blind taste test and say, here are just a lot of very pretty lenses, see what you think, see if these suit your project. I think a lot of people would be surprised. I went to essentially a blind lens test that the AFC, France's Cinematography Society, put on in Los Angeles a few months ago. And it was really interesting because you don't know what any of these lenses are. They just show you sort of it's like a 25 millimeter and a 50 millimeter from each of these 30 sets. And you just sort of make notes about what you like, what about each lens you like. And a lot of the glass that people would probably say that they love or say that they want to shoot with generally didn't get very high marks, where the favorites among that group of cinematographers tended to be Cooke S4s, it tended to be Master Primes, it tended to be sort of very clean stuff. And the really wild vintage Panavision lenses that I think people covet and people, you know, crawl over one another to shoot with were less popular. They had a lot of veiling glare, they had a lot of sort of weird aberrations. And so if you can present something in an objective way, I think it actually gives people a lot more freedom to decide what suits the project really well, and not worry about whether it's Zeiss or Leica or a $40, you know, Yashica lens from the 70s.
So Alex, we have some questions in our Q&A. We're gonna get there, but now I would like to ask you about your process. I mean, how does your research happens? The process to find and choose these lenses to work with. I heard some interviews that you bring lenses from other purpose, like lenses from military drones or even astrophotography. How it works for you, this process?
So initially it was just a matter of personal taste. The pinhole lens that we started with was just something I wanted for myself. It was something I wanted to be able to shoot with, and there wasn't an option out there to shoot properly with a pinhole lens for cinematography. You know, there are a lot of tutorials online about getting some like aluminum foil and just poking a hole and sort of taping that in front of your camera, but nothing that you could put a matte box on, nothing that you could attach to a PL mounted camera and use with any sort of degree of precision. And it was sort of the same thing with the original Baltar project. When I started those, nobody else was rehousing them. It was something that I wanted to shoot with, so I had to buy all the lenses and figure out what was necessary to make them work. As we've gotten bigger as a company, people just naturally bring us things, and they approach us about projects that we wouldn't otherwise think to offer or realize that there might be a market for. And it really runs the gamut from, for example, like that old X-ray lens or the Nikon Noct, the 58 1.2 that they made for astrophotography. And at this point, we very much have an open door policy. If you know, someone has a project that just seems interesting, we'll try to find a way to accommodate it. Because it's, you know, like I said, like I didn't come from an engineering background, I came from cinematography. Both of my parents are architects, and so I've always sort of had a foot in each camp as far as technology and design and art. And so I'm very interested in any kind of project that is unique and fascinating and helps filmmakers create something that's unique rather than what is sort of the obvious choice to offer. You know, there are some things that we sort of have to offer because the market is there, and it would be silly, for example, not to do like ours. But if someone approaches us and says, I'm shooting a movie on IMAX and I want to build T 1.5 lenses for it, that's also something I'd really like to do, and something we've offered in the past. And it's, you know, those aren't usually very lucrative projects. We usually just about break even on those, but I think that's sort of a core part of the spirit of the company is turning over, you know, rocks and seeing sort of what stuff out there hasn't been done before and then maybe isn't the obvious choice for rehousing.
Amazing, really nice. And this about this optical improvement that you were talking about, this fully re-engineer of the mechanical part of the lenses to try to make them as close to cinema spec as possible, like minimum focus distance and reverse the focus direction, like in Nikon lenses, or declick the aperture ring? May you talk about this standard structure of the primes?
Sure. So it's a little bit misleading because, for example, with the Nikons, people have asked if we reverse the direction of focus so that it works the way most cinema lenses do. And in a way, we're not reversing the direction because we're not actually using any of Nikon's original mechanical parts. So we're not fixing something, we're just completely replacing it from scratch. The lenses that we rehouse are, all we take from the original lens is the glass itself. So we put in a new circular iris, the mechanical design is completely ground up. And so that gives us a lot of freedom to improve the precision, to improve, like you said, the close focus if possible, which can be tricky with lenses that have floating element designs where you have two different groups of glass that move at different rates as you focus. But if you have something like the Baltars where you just have a single cell moving back and forth, the close focus is only limited by how far you're willing or able to move that from the film plane. So you could make a macro if you're willing to make a lens that's very long or very large. And so for us, it's mostly just looking at the different sort of demands of the industry and what would be useful to cinematographers and to camera assistants, because in some cases we could improve close focus even more than we have, but it might mean that the lens, becomes this long rather than something that's that long just to get a few more inches of close focus. And, would you rather have 3 more inches of close focus and have a gigantic lens on your camera, or would you rather have something that's fairly small and lightweight and just have to move the tripod or move the dolly in a little bit to get that close focus? But yeah, I mean, it's having worked in rental houses and having worked as a camera assistant and then having service, I try to sort all of that experience to the rehousing process and make lenses that are easy for camera assistants to work with, easy for rental houses to maintain, easy for us to build. And sort of juggle all of those things so that nobody feels like we've cut a corner in service of something that maybe makes our job easier or makes it cheaper to build, but doesn't make it a useful product for filmmakers.
Really appreciate this worry about the camera assistant job. Nice.
I know the pain.
And when we test vintage lenses, we usually find big difference of definition. Sometimes it's in the same set. And besides this mechanical part, how do you deal with this optical review? I mean, probably you have some feedbacks. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it can be tricky with vintage still photo lenses because still photography, you don't usually, unless you're maybe a studio photographer, you don't usually have the full range of focal lengths from a given manufacturer. The market for, say, a very fast 85 is typically like portrait photographers, and they might not need a fisheye. And so still photography lens companies, manufacturers rather, they usually approach each focal length as a different product. They're not trying to make them match. They're not looking for the same consistency that cinema lens manufacturers are. And so that can be a little bit difficult. And I think some of our clients just make peace with that, that there might be a slight color temperature shift. There might be a slightly different sort of feel from one lens to the next. And you just have to sort of decide whether or not it's something that you're comfortable dealing with in post-production, or if you need to find something that is a little bit more consistent. And usually the older you get, the more consistency there is because there were fewer options for manufacturers. The coatings were essentially identical for most manufacturers from the late 30s through the early to mid 60s. And then they started developing their own multi-coating recipes. And so Canon, for example, started making very warm coatings. Leica kept to sort of purple. Nikon eventually went towards coatings that veer a little green. And so we'll do certain tests, but it's mostly something that individual clients have to look at very critically and decide how much they're willing to put up with, and whether a given set is actually going to be practical for them for production, or if it's going to pose more problems than it solves. So we'll inspect optical condition for different lenses, and we'll tell clients if there is, say, fungus or haze or something that we can't easily fix, and that might, say, rob them of contrast or resolution. But other than that, we kind of have to leave it up to them, because, you know, we can't impose our own taste in lenses on our clients. There are just too many options out there for us to say, you know, what you've picked is wrong or won't work well.
Nice.
I have a question. Sorry.
Please.
Now, about coating, does it, with time, does time really affects coating, and how does it affect it? I feel that if I use a very old lens, it has like a Cook tried to they didn't try, they released some new, the Cook they were saying that it has that vintage look, but the coating is so different from the old S3 Cooks, you know, the new Cook. And how's that recipe works? I mean, is time a factor on coating? The fact that it's been there on the glass for so long that it kind of lost a little bit, so it gives you different glares and flares? Or I'm asking because I don't know, you know, just out of curiosity, really.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it definitely, it's not difficult to replicate vintage coatings, but like you said, just the nature of how long they've been on a piece of glass contributes a lot to the look. You know, if you have a lens from the 1940s, and you know it has seen decades of camera assistants, you know, cleaning it with a t-shirt rather than you know, being very careful with it, that will wear the coatings out. That will introduce sort of small scratches and cleaning marks, which they'll make the coating thinner, and they'll degrade the glass in such a way that you'll get usually a softer image, you'll get less flare protection. And so, you know, like we could polish and recoat a vintage lens and put the exact same coating on it that they would have used in the 1940s, but because it hasn't been abused essentially for a long time, it'll never look exactly like a vintage lens.
Exactly.
And it's funny too to see, first there was sort of the trend of taking modern lenses and removing the coatings, at least from a few elements, but now that has sort of evolved into using vintage coatings on modern lenses. And it's sort of, I think it sort of misses the point with a lot of vintage glass, because like Tokina has a really cool set, the Vista ones, where they use a single coating, a vintage single coating on all the glass rather than the very modern multi-coating. And it has a really unique look. But what's different between those and vintage lenses is less about the coating and more about the fact that the Tokinas use an enormous number of actual glass elements inside, where most vintage lenses only had maybe 4 to 6 elements. And that plays as much a role in the flare that you get as the coatings do. And so it's a combination of age, but also just what sort of technology and what sort of designs people were manufacturing 40, 50, 60 years ago.
And
I think you're muted again.
Yeah, he mentioned about the coating and the relationship between new coating with old lenses and old coating with new lenses. So I normally say that we are in a moment for the market is a kind of third lens vintage revival, because yeah, the first one when we start to reuse the S3 and the Pancros and the K35s, and later we have the full frame lens. But now we have a lot of manufacturers or service companies just customizing the modern lenses. I have in Brazil one set of Gecko vintage Supreme Primes. That's pretty cool. But of course, have its limitations. Pierre already used that. He can tell better than I about the effect. We have the master built lenses that are based on the Tokina lenses. To everyone, Tokina lenses are outstanding lenses, but it's not so strong to us because we are normally using the Supreme Primes and Signature Primes, but everyone should take a look over that because it's a real nice set. But in your projects, are you planning to do this kind of work, to some adjustment on coating or spacing to make the light reflect between the glasses? Because what you can tell more about this process of getting a new lenses, transforming it in a virtual vintage lenses like the Gecko and the Master Built, or probably another brands, Contact, I think that may have, and so on. What you can tell about this?
Yeah, I mean, it's not something we've tackled at Zerø Optik. When I worked at Duclos, though, we did what was called sort of the Classicron series, where we took Summicron Cs from Leica and played with coatings and air gaps. And it's a tricky kind of project because when you're starting with very modern lenses, and so precise that if you start to play with coatings, it's not as simple as just recoating the front element and it suddenly has a vintage look to it, because the coating might, or the front element might be an A-sphere, and if you don't know that and you just polish it clean and put a new coating on it, the lens may just look terrible. It may not look like a vintage lens. It may just look like a very bad lens. And so with that kind of project, there is a lot of trial and error. So you have to sort of pick something where you can get a lot of spare parts very easily, or you're just willing to spend a year, like with master primes, for example. If you could just spend a year going through each focal length and saying like, okay, we can't do anything to the front element because that'll just ruin the lens, but maybe the next element in we can play with, and you might ruin that, and then you have to buy a new piece of glass, put it in there, and sort of keep working your way through the optical design. And so it's certainly something we're open to, but without a specific project, a specific cinematographer in mind, it can be hard to know what look you actually want, because everybody's taste is different. I remember talking to someone at Leica probably 3 or 4 years ago, because they got a lot of requests for doing anamorphic lenses, from the ground up. And the problem they ran into was they would talk to cinematographers, and no cinematographer could agree on what they actually wanted Leica anamorphics to look like. Should they be a 1.3 squeeze, a 2 times, a 1.8? Should they be super 35 or full frame? Should they be really high performing? Should they not be? Should they look more like Lomos? And so, if you don't have a specific goal in mind, it can be hard to sort of just tackle a project like that unilaterally, where if a director came to us and said, I have a feature shooting at the end of the year, and I love the way ultra primes look, but I want to add a little more sort of character to them, then we could start to explore what might be possible and what sort of look would best serve that project. So in all of our projects, all of our rehousings, the potential is there to play with air gaps and to play with coatings. And we work with a really amazing coating company that can do everything from vintage coatings to modern multi-coatings. We have the original Canon SSC recipe, for example. So it's just a matter of how much sort of time and work and effort a given client is willing to invest to pull something like that off.
I have another question that maybe it's interesting to everyone. Can you tell more about the Hawk lenses in your experience? Because we have a classic story that Hawk lenses are Lomos, and what happened exactly there? They hired a Lomo engineer, or what exactly was the first generation of the Hawk lenses, the C lenses?
My understanding is that it was that the initial series, the first 4 focal lengths were based at least heavily on Lomo designs. I don't have a particularly clear or sophisticated understanding of their history up to this point, as far as where the designs or the glass is sourced, though. So I'm not sure. I don't want to speculate.
So I think that we can maybe talk a little bit about an aesthetic and artistic look of these vintage lenses and this rehousing world. Maybe Pierre wants to bring some experience to share with us. What makes Pierre, this is for you, give some break to Alex. What makes a DOP to choose vintage lenses? How does it deal with the narrative aspects to you in a movie?
I think it comes from the, what makes me go to a vintage lens? I think when I'm doing a feature or even a commercial, we'd like to try to find some personality for the image of that project. And that's where the vintage really comes handy in that way, because there's so much I like to call them the egg kinder. Like, you don't know, you have to go to the rental house and start testing them. And sometimes what I like to do, it's when I can, when the budget allows, is try to mix 2 sets of lenses, because then I see, oh, this one should be really great for close-ups, and then this other one is going to be great for wide open shots. And it all comes down a little bit to it. So we try first with the director to talk about the movie, to how do we feel the story that we want to tell, and how we want to present the story, and how we translate this story into image. And that's, I mean, you can go, if you go to the most iconic brands, you kind of already know what you're getting, and you've seen it already before a lot. So the vintage lenses, they offer this new territory kind of, but it's just try and error, really, because I have a little bit of problems with the Super Bowl TARP. For an example, that every time I pick some, I felt they were too milky for me, and I felt a little bit, it lacked a little bit of contrast, and it was just too milky. And when I start using the, let's say, the famous K35s, it felt just a perfect balance of contrast, of softness, and the fallout of the focus is just amazing. The way that it goes from sharp to unfocus, it feels like there's a very soft feather between the sharpness and the blurriness. And and this is sometimes for faces, for close-ups. It's really a beautiful lens for faces, and that's a little bit how it goes. And I like to think every project, I'm not, for myself, I think it's very personal also, but for myself, I really like to every project to find its specific look. So it's really a research question. Now you have to, and that's why I have a good. Gabriel was one of the pioneers in that sense here in Brazil, because the other rental houses, they wanted just to follow the trend. So, oh, Ari is releasing new lenses, Cook is releasing new lenses, we're getting that. And with Gabriel, he was one of the first to bring the, let's say, when we had this the anamorphic trend arriving on digital, it was a new land of possibilities. And all the anamorphic, back in the day in Brazil, when we were shooting film, we didn't have anamorphics really in Brazil. There was a legend that there was some Panavision somewhere, but we never used it really because it was super expensive. And then when the digital era came in, it became so affordable to shoot in anamorphics because it didn't involve so much process in the post-production. It was something all done digitally and very easy to do. So it expanded a new, I feel that in Brazil, it started with the anamorphics, with the Koa, like with the Hawk C series, like the cheap anamorphics. And from there, I think Gabriel and some few other people started to invest in vintage lenses. And for myself, I started traveling a little bit around to do commercials around the world a little bit. So I get the opportunity to put my hand on different kind of glasses. And then the word spread and we start talking to each other like, oh, look at the commercial I did with this lens. It really worked out. And from the commercials, it's a place when you can explore a lot because there is the money, so you can say, oh, I want this lens, I want that lens. And when you go do a feature or personal project, you already know what you want because you've tested it on commercials before. So it's for me, it's really that it's the eternal search of giving personality to the project you're doing, to the image you want to create. So that's how it goes for me. And I think now that, like we were saying before, with this new full frame area, large format cameras, it's very, very exciting times because now everything is possible. Like Eric's company, Zerø Optik, it's all about that. They're starting on right now. That is the best moment because I don't know what we're going to get in the future, but it's going to be nice. It's going to be really exciting, that plan.
Totally. And about this researching that you were talking about, thinking about the diversity of vintage lenses, how to keep updated, how to researching new possibilities of them. I imagine that you already have found in other projects what have worked for you.
Sorry, I say again. I lost the question.
Okay, no problem. I was asking about this keeping researching possibilities to
yes.
keeping you updated, and since you have already found what works for you in other projects, things that you already tested, lenses you already like it, how you keep this updated?
This is thanks to the internet, really. You keep on looking on Vimeo, talking to friends a lot, other DOPs, and with Gabriel, with rental house people. It's a research. It's a kind of a slow research because it's an expensive material, and you don't have the cameras always on hand. For myself, I'm lucky because I purchased an Alexa body, so it's easier to test out lenses. But now we are in this, like Gabriel said, I feel there's two moments now. There is the moment that you have some new exciting brands like the Bradford Young brand, the Tribe 7. I haven't tried them yet, but I've seen a lot of intriguing images that came out of it, and I think this is kind of a new era for lenses in a way, because it's a DOP that is involved in it with engineers. It's so it's you have all the sensitivity of an artist. Brands like Zerø Optik also, because Eric comes from a cinematography background. I feel that with all the computer programming, all the hard part, like you said, Eric, it seems to be easier because now you have the computer programs that can calculate everything for you. So things are easily done. And now I think that the future, when a director comes to you with a photography or an image, and he says, oh, I'd like my movie to look like that, we will be able to maybe build a lens or two before this was completely, at least, yeah, it was a dream. Now we feel that it's more possible in a way, because let's say I bought this Petzval lens rehoused by TLS. It was 3,000 pounds, which is not so expensive, because then the glass is not expensive. It's just the rehousing that is expensive. It's so little by little, I'm trying to build my set of lenses, and it doesn't have to be a proper set. It's just kind of different lenses that I can use sometimes I did this WhatsApp commercial, let's say, the one in Rio de Janeiro, and we shot mainly with Zeiss Supremes, but there was this moment when the main actor was really sad because he lost everything. His school samba was on fire, and his carnival school was on fire. And at that point, I felt like, oh, for that moment, I want to use the Petzval lens, because it's going to give a really weird bokeh with the flames and some flares. And this is a moment we want to isolate him completely from the rest. And we only used at that moment this lens, and the rest of the movie we kept on the Supreme Primes because we wanted some consistency throughout the story. But so it came kind of a mix in a way like that. And I mean, the research for that, it's out of experience, really, out of talking to Gabriel, because I've used the Petzval lens in still photography, and I told Gabriel, oh man, I love these lenses. Do you know if someone is rehousing them? And then he told me, oh, I just rehoused them with TLS, and they're arriving here in Brazil just for right before your shoot. So I said, oh, I'm gonna pick it and pick up them and see, and it really worked out fine in that way. So the research is a never-ending research, really. You have to be curious about it, and always go to rental houses and talk to your friends and experiment stuff, really. And now, yes, now it's that's it. Yeah.
Nice. And to complete this aesthetic and artistic decisions, how you deal with the idea of the protagonism that lenses like this can have? I mean, finding this balance between optics, movement, and light.
Mm-hmm. Now, this is really about the story. I mean, I like vintage lenses, but I also like, let's say, regular lenses also. It's all about, I'm not a fan of flare just for flare. I think it has to come a time in the story, in the script, that you read, that you feel that, oh, This is a moment where the character is in deep sorrow. Like, I'm giving an example, or he's going through some really difficult times, or on the less he's really happy, and he's swimming and having a, I'm just giving an example, having a good time in nature, and you read in the script that the sun is, all the elements of nature are coming in and are reaching, and he has this communion with nature. So I say, oh, okay, now for that moment it will be good if we could have a lens that has a lot of flare, because I think flares, the good stuff about flare is that it feels that the light materialize itself. The light comes into the image and becomes a protagonist. And if you're looking for that, then yes, then you're not using lenses that have too much coating, because otherwise you won't be able to have that. And I really like to mix all that. But I've read like interviews with Roger Deakins. He said that he hated flares. He hates when artifacts come into the image, because he wants to be all about the story and he doesn't want to be distracted by. But that's really personal, you know. I agree, but I don't agree. I think at some points, at the same time, if I see pictures that the other day I saw a silly picture, but like John Wick with Keanu Reeves, and it was shot on vintage lenses, but for no reason. So you have like a lot of, you see that it lacks a lot of focus on the borders of the frame, and it only looks like they did it because they thought it was cool, but it doesn't fit the story at all, and it becomes something that takes you out of the story completely. So it's really about your personal take on the story, your personal take on what you want to say, and it's all about a balance, really, of how you want to present that. And there's no recipes at all. It's only comes from your feeling for your view on the story, and there's no wrong and there's no right. It's just about you know.
Yes. And Alex and Gabriel, do you want to add something on that?
Yes. Okay, it's curious to listen Pierre mentioning using high perform modern lenses like the Super Primes mixed with the Petzval 58. It's a kind of special lens because they have a very strong bokeh. So I would share with you a brief selection of lenses that are mostly classics, okay? That may probably Alex know some, like Canon Dream. Yeah, it's a special one. But I consider can you tell us if you're receiving lenses like that to be rehoused, because we are talking about very old classics. I recommend to everyone to search for a page named Manual Focus Lenses, MFL Lenses. Is a big forum just between still photographers discussing about bokeh and special lenses. There you can find the Super Takumar lenses from Pentax. You can find the Fulgior. I don't know, it's a kind of French K35. It's a very hard and interesting lens. It's worth something like 20,000 euros for just 150. The Trio Plan 100. We have the Foca, a French one, the 50. So we have the new semi-young lenses are very interesting lenses that are being used. The Topcon 45, the Iris Coral 45. So I recommend you to search around for the classic lenses, because there are a lot of old classics for each brand. All the brands have one or two or maybe all special lenses, but normally are lenses that have problems. A classic example is the 44-2 Helios 58 2.8. It's called the worst lens in the world. Yeah, probably it's competing with the Nikon 43-86. It's called also the worst lens in the world, but it's beautiful sometimes. Yeah, it has some color and flares. So the idea is that all the lens brands have something special, maybe one piece or two, or all the lens depending on your taste. And that's it. Yeah, that's something I would like to share with you.
Okay, now I think we can go to Q&A. We have some questions here for Alex. Renato Oja asks, what do you think about these new initiatives like Brett for Young's Blackwing 7 that promise personalized tuning? How can that kind of glass be compared to vintage lenses?
I think those are actually, they're really exciting because they are new designs and they have been designed specifically to allow for tuning or detuning. And that's something sort of going back to the concept of playing with very modern lenses and trying to essentially mess them up to make them more interesting. That can be a bit tricky if you don't know the exact optical design, if you don't know what coatings they used, and they may not all allow for the same kinds of detuning, where if you begin a project, if you design a lens from the ground up, with that in mind, you can give yourself the opportunity to move certain elements around or recoat specific surfaces. And I think that is a really clever way to launch a product. There's also a set of anamorphics, full frame anamorphics out of Germany from Glasswork that's sort of similar. They began that project knowing that even though they had these incredibly sophisticated optical designs, they already knew which surfaces internally they could recoat to get a more vintage character or to allow people to sort of play with the look more. So I think I'd love to see new lenses go more in that direction because it opens up possibilities that vintage lenses don't necessarily offer. Usually the older you get with lens designs, the fewer variables there are to play with. You know, if you only have 6 pieces of glass inside a lens, then you don't have the same degree of freedom to adjust things. Where if you have 12 pieces of glass and you've already that you want to leave room for adjustment, the possibilities are almost limitless.
Nice. And we have a question about subject that we were talking in the beginning, and actually in terms of Brazil, this is an answer, and in the West is probably totally different. But Gail Varala asks, I would like to know how is the way to learn this craft, and if it's possible on a handmade scale, how it's possible to start, please. Thanks.
I can only speak to my experience.
Of course.
I think it's difficult because there are so many things that need to be juggled in terms of knowledge or experience. So before I worked at Duclos, I worked in a couple of different rental houses and learned machining at one of them. One of the rental houses I worked for actually had a CNC mill. And so I taught myself how to machine parts, which even though I don't do that anymore, it's really valuable information to have because I can design components for our lenses in a way that I know they can be manufactured. And if a machinist comes to me and says, I don't know how we're supposed to make this part, I already have an idea. We can sort of talk it out. So having that kind of background is really important. But also, like I said about working at Duclos, there were just so many different lenses available to take apart, to play with, to test. I think that's probably the most critical experience to have because you need to see how other manufacturers have dealt with a particular problem if you're going to have any hope of figuring it out yourself, because there's no point in essentially reinventing everything from scratch if it's already been dealt with. So, and I think part of it is also just bringing your own knowledge and experience to it. That's what makes it interesting. There are only about 6 rehousing companies in the world, and they're pretty well spread out. So I think there's a lot of room for innovation and for someone to bring a unique sort of take and perspective to it.
Yes. Gabriel, want to add something?
The question is regard someone interested on learning more about the manufacturing and service lenses. Is that correct?
How to start exactly?
Yeah, how to start? Yeah, yeah, it's pretty nice. Yeah, what I can say about this at Classic in Brazil, we have a few technicians. We need more technicians in Brazil. That's pretty important to know, and because there are too many different lenses and ads. If you go to Duclos, they will say to you, okay, we don't work with Lomos. If you go to TLS, they will say, I don't work with anamorphics. If you go to, so every place have a different specialization or a different, of course that they know the overall construction and the overall service, but it's nice to have more options because each place probably may have a more accurate experience when discussing a specific product. So here in Brazil, we have a small service point on my company, but it is pretty small. It's pretty simple. We don't machine parts. We need to send to third-party suppliers, but we need more people doing that. That's something really, really important. Yeah, always. Yeah.
Okay, so let's continue with the Q&A. Marcelo Trota from ABC would like to know your opinion on the growth of interest on Nikkor ALs for scene, and also if you have ever rehoused any Soligor CDs.
We haven't done any Soligor lenses. I think they're fairly simple though, so that's something we could probably manage pretty easily. I grew up with Nikon cameras and lenses, so started that project. It had a sort of personal resonance for me, but it's also, I mean, Nikons have a very sort of rich history of use in cinematography. They used to be the most common lens, I think, on VistaVision cameras, especially for shooting visual effects cinematography. You know, for Star Wars, for Indiana Jones, they would often adapt or modify Nikon lenses. And it's been funny, since we announced our Nikon rehousing, we have had so many cinematographers reach out to us and say, you know, I've been trying to shoot with these for decades, and there hasn't been a good option. So even though rental houses were sort of skeptical when we announced it, the cinematography community sort of exploded with interest. And I think that speaks a lot to the sort of natural character and flavor of Nikon glass. It has something that is, it's very high performing, but it's not sterile. You know, it's not like shooting with, say, signature primes where they're deliberately very, very clean, very sharp, and don't introduce anything to the image. The Nikon AIS primes resolve very well, but they leave a little room to sort of play with them, and to play with the way that they flare or the way that they focus and the way focus falls off in an image. And so that has been one of the most exciting projects for us to bring those back to the cinematography community.
Okay, so next one, we're going to finish, so I will try to answer all the Q&A, and let's see if we have time. So Rafa Varandas asks, which glass company was the major donor for all the major rental cine houses all over the world? Nikon, Leica, Canons, FDs?
I think it depends. I mean, most rental companies around the world tend to carry stuff that that pretty much anybody could buy. And so I think Panavision is probably the oldest rental house or rental company that used pre-existing glass but sort of modified it or added anamorphic elements. And you can find all sorts of manufacturers represented in their inventory. They had a lot of Minolta, a lot of Nikon. I don't think they had as much Leica in their inventory as people assume. There's, I think, a lot of confusion about the fact that Leica's factory in Canada manufactured a lot of glass for Panavision, but they were making things based on Panavision's designs. They weren't taking Leica R's, for example, and writing Panavision on them. So it's, I think Nikon, Canon, and Minolta were probably the biggest sort of providers of base optics to a lot of companies, like Cineovision lenses. The Tadeos were mostly Canon and Nikon. And I mean, you know, smart or clever rental houses, especially going back a ways, tend not to tell you what's inside their specialty glass. They'll put their own branding on it. They'll call it something kind of fun or dramatic, and you know, it gives the air of exclusivity, and it sort of, again, it gets you away from picking something based on brand and more because it's actually cool to shoot with. It looks really interesting, and it suits the project really well.
Of course. Okay, next one. Galvaral again. Just another question. Is there a way to extend the life of a good zoom lenses used in old camcorders, just such as Zeiss used in Sony's 8VR Z7 via rehousing?
Not easily. Most of those camcorders, they didn't use CMOS sensors, so they used CCDs, which meant you had 3 sensors in each camera, one for each color. So you had a sensor for red, for green, and for blue. And the optics to work with these collections of sensors so that you had light going through a prism and splitting up the image into red, green, and blue. So to rehouse something like that, you basically have to build a prism into the housing. And so the coverage would be a problem, and you'd also have to deal with sort of the inherent optical qualities of compensating for that. I think IBE made an adapter several years ago that allowed you to use old broadcast zooms on like an Alexa, and those basically worked the same way. So you had to have this adapter that made all of the different light wavelengths hit the sensor at the same time rather than the way they were originally designed. So it's not impossible, but it's probably not economically feasible for most people.
Right. Rafa Varandas asks, which names was decisive for the development cinematic projects on those glasses?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah, me neither. Which glasses?
He probably the engineers, behind the project.
Sorry?
The engineers behind the project. Is that correct?
I'm not sure, Rafa, if you can send this complementation of the question. I'm not sure either. So next one, Mario Savi. Hey guys, Alex, in this kind of projects, do you ever been asked to rehouse a lens but add some kind of effect, like a haze reducing contrast or some color aberration? How possible is that, and how far can you go modifying the original look of a lens? Thanks.
So far we haven't really been asked to introduce any kind of strange effects to lenses, but we had one quite famous director actually bring us a series of Canon rangefinder lenses, and it was kind of stressful because at first I didn't know what the look was that he was going for. So we got all these lenses in, and they needed to be rehoused very quickly to work on this feature film that he was going to be shooting in about a month. And I started inspecting the lenses, and they all had terrible fungus and haze and dust inside. And normally when we see that, that's not what clients want. They normally want to have the cleanest lens possible so that camera assistants won't kick the lens back, or the image won't be negatively affected. And so I talked to the director, and he said, no, that's what I want. Don't clean any of those lenses out. I want the very low contrast look that having 30 years worth of fungus inside a lens will actually give you. And so he had, for that feature, he had 3 different 50mm Canon Dream lenses and 3 different 35mm f1.5 Canon rangefinder lenses. And each one had a different amount of fungus and haze in it. So it sort of had this built-in filter effect, and he could decide, for this scene, I want to use the 50 that doesn't have too much haze, or I want to use the one that gives you this really crazy glow if you have the actor backlit. So we've had stuff like that. That said, if someone wanted us to introduce lower contrast or play with air gaps, we certainly can. We build in centering adjustments to all of our lenses, usually to make the performance as good as it possibly can be. But we have also had people ask about creating sort of offset smearing effects. So if you take a very wide angle lens and you take the front group and the rear group and you shift them off axis, you can end up with a lot of sort of smearing to one side that almost looks like a split diopter effect. And so the possibilities are there, and we have sort of the equipment and the knowledge to do it, but we haven't had a lot of requests for essentially detuning.
Pretty nice. João Abreu Dias. Hello, everyone. Hi, Alex. Do you think it's possible to rehouse on an Takumar set for LPL mount, and will it be economically viable?
Yeah, it's definitely possible. We've had a few requests for those, so it's probably something we'll be offering hopefully later this year. Like I said earlier, we sort of design most of our lenses for PL mount because that's the trickiest to accommodate. And so if we do a rehousing for the Takumars in PL mount, then LPL would be very easy to offer as well. It would just be a swappable mount. We've designed our housing so that you could do PL, LPL, Canon EF, and a rental house or a camera assistant could swap those mounts very easily. So it wouldn't be any more expensive than anything else we build.
Good news. Adilson MP asks if you have some optical physics books to indicate.
There is one. There's a really good book. It's a bit expensive. I think it's probably around $250, but it's probably the best book out right now, called Applied Photographic Optics by Sidney Ray, because that actually gets into not just optical engineering, but how it's applied to the lenses that we use for capturing images. Because optical engineers could be designing lasers, they could be designing X-ray machines, and so if you just pick up a book on the physics of optics, there is often a lot of stuff in there that you maybe don't really care about or don't need to know. Also, if you know Jay Holben and Chris Probst, they are working on essentially the ultimate book in optics and lenses for cinematography. And I think at the moment it's up to about 800 pages that I think is going to be out next year. So I would definitely watch out for that, because that's going to apply the best to cinematographers.
And any thoughts on rehousing modern lenses such as Canon RF glass to remove the focus by wire mechanism and putting a proper focus ring?
It's something we've begun to look at. It can be very tricky with some of those lenses because there is often a lot of plastic. There are often sort of very loose tolerances in the original housing. And they're not designed to be taken apart or serviced the same way vintage lenses were. So the engineering process to rehousing those can be a little bit more treacherous. But it is something that we've begun exploring because, like Gabriel mentioned earlier, you know, there are a lot of really exciting pieces of glass being manufactured now that, you know, that a reflex mirror is no longer something that has to be dealt with. And I think a lot of people are eager to make use of, you know, some of this very exotic glass. Nikon has the new version of their Noct is a 58 millimeter f/0.95 that is incredibly high performing, and being able to offer something like that for cinema would be really exciting. It's just the startup sort of process is a little bit more than with other stuff that we work on.
So the other question that we didn't understand, the question was, which names was decisive for the development cinematic projects on those glasses? And Rafa wrote later, the names that revolutionized this front. To get it.
It looks like he's got another, he said the names of the masters of this art historically and sources to search more about it. I mean, as far as optical engineering goes, it's not, it's sort of unfortunately a lot of the engineers behind some of the really legendary glass, it's sort of private information. You know, Nikon doesn't really tell you who's behind some of the really brilliant stuff that they've made. And even the big cinema manufacturers, you don't. The one except Ian Neal, who he was at Panavision for a very long time. He was behind a lot of their sort of big optical achievements. He also designed Leica's Summilux Cs. He designed Cooke's anamorphics, and he's sort of the lone like rock star optical engineer, at least in the cinema world. Sort of lesser known is Brian Caldwell, who he has his own series of anamorphics out right now called the Chameleons. He is also making, he has the original blueprints and designs for the Super Baltars and the original Baltars, and he's begun remanufacturing those. But if you look at a lot of big lens manufacturers, we don't really get to know who's behind the really impressive technical achievements that they've put out.
Okay. And what's the difference between flare and glare, and how we can control flare in vintage lenses for housing?
So glare is often the result of flaring a lens. It usually relates to how strong the coatings are or how they've been applied. And so if you have a light source in the frame, you'll almost always get lens flare unless you're working with something like signature primes that are just really, really well controlled. But if you use vintage lenses, you'll usually get sort of like, you know, circles of different sizes and colors. And if there isn't a lot of coating, or if there isn't any coating on the lens, then usually the image will just glare over. It'll just get, you know, might just go sort of milky white. And so it's not something, usually when we rehouse lenses, the idea is to preserve whatever the original characteristics are for the lens. So if it naturally flares really easily. We don't want to prevent that. Really, the only option you would have to change that characteristic is either to set the lens very far back in the housing so that light can't easily get in, or to just recoat the lens so that it's less likely to flare over glare.
Really nice. Thank you. So I think that we can make some final sentence to finish. Let's talk if you want to add something or remember something that you can bring that is interesting, because we are on time. So I don't know, maybe Gabriel, Pierre, Alex, what do you think? Want to add something more?
I have a question. It's
Please.
really, because I really don't really know about it, but how much of the making of the glass or the quality of the glass, I mean, the glass, it's always come from these big companies, Nikon, Canon, or do you make your own glass for some lenses? It's really because I don't know, you know, but I'm curious about it. And is it the glass, or is it more about the coating that makes the quality of the image, or is there like a special sand to make that glass, or is that, because this is another, I don't know, it's just out of curiosity.
Yeah, I mean, the glass itself has an enormous impact on the image, not just the composition of the glass, but also how it's turned into an actual optical element. If you look at vintage lenses, they often used very sort of primitive or crude polishing techniques, and in some cases they were hand polished, and so just the imperfections that you get give, you know, for one thing, they create a certain inconsistency from one lens to the next, but they also give you a certain lack of precision that I think is really appealing if you have a very sharp sensor that you're working with, which is one reason why vintage lenses lead used to be a very common ingredient in optical glass, and that can have an enormous impact on the image as well. Or I think one of the questions we get a lot is about radioactive elements. You know, there are some elements in super Baltars or in the Canon FDs and K35s that have trace amounts of thorium, and that, for better or worse, can change the image. As the glass ages, it can shift the color a little bit warmer. And so one of the big sort of hurdles that modern manufacturers have if they want to replicate a slightly softer, more vintage look is dealing with the fact that a lot of these ingredients are no longer legal to use. You can't use lead in glass anymore, and you certainly can't use thorium. So, for example, when Cooke remanufactured their Speed Panchros, there were just certain things that they couldn't replicate. They couldn't use the same glass that the original Cooke Panchros used. So they had to sort of approximate the same image characteristics as best they could with modern glass, which is also why I think rehousing or the use of vintage lenses has a place no matter how good or how interesting modern lens manufacturers make their products, because there are just certain things about it that cannot be replicated anymore, and you couldn't offer these the exact same lens, and you couldn't offer the exact same look with a lens.
That's why the K35 are not possible to be back, even though Canon has they made a new one. I forgot the name, but they told that they were really resembling the K35, and I've looked at them, and that has nothing to do with
right.
Probably because of that. Yeah.
And I think it's also, I mean, it's important to look at sort of the historical context of some of these lenses, because the lenses that are popular right now weren't always popular, and in some cases they were deeply unpopular. So, like the Canon K35s, when they came out, they were essentially a low budget alternative to Zeiss super speeds. You know, they were not a premium product, and right now they're probably among the most expensive lenses that you could buy. But for a long time, they were not popular. They weren't something people wanted to rent or wanted to shoot with. And same with the Speed Panchros or the Super Baltars. They, you know, especially when film was still the capture medium, they were considered to be just bad, low-performing lenses. And so what ended up happening was a lot of the manufacturers threw out, you know, old glass. They threw out the designs. Like Brian Caldwell, for example, has the original designs for the Super Baltars because Bosch and Lohm put them in a dumpster. Like it wasn't something that they wanted to keep. And it's the same thing with the Leica Rs, for example. The Leica R line was Leica's attempt at getting into the SLR market, where their strong suit, their strongest product was making rangefinders, and Nikon and Canon and Zeiss had already sort of dominated the SLR market. And so at some point, they were just losing money with these lenses, and they were bought out. And the new owner said, "We're getting rid of this. We're not going to make these anymore. We're not going to pursue this because this is a waste of time." And they threw away all the old designs. So if Leica wanted to remake the Leica Rs, they'd have to buy old lenses on eBay like everybody else and reverse engineer them. And so it's funny because I think a lot of these manufacturers had a very forward-looking kind of philosophy that just sort of assumed that whatever they had made in the past was never going to be useful again. And they couldn't replicate a lot of their old products if they wanted to.
Okay, may I have a question? What's your favorite lens ever as a cinematographer? Not the easiest to be searched, okay? I mean the most beautiful one, maybe a special lens, a special story you have with something like that.
Yeah. I mean, as far as I think a cinematography point of view, I really love the Nikon 15 mil f3. The image it makes is really gorgeous. The flares are very pretty, and given that my parents are architects, I really gravitate toward architectural photography, and so that 15 millimeter, it's a rectilinear fisheye, and you can get these very dramatic sort of enhanced sort of perspective shots that really they exaggerate the lines in the composition, and there's something about that lens that's just sort of magical. From a rehousing standpoint, though, I think my favorite project was we built an Ingenue 50 millimeter f.95 a couple of years ago, and it is an extraordinarily rare lens. A rental house in Paris, RVZ, had sent us a few to rehouse, and I mentioned it to a friend of mine who actually worked at Ingenue, and he said, "Oh, we have some of those lenses still at the factory." And they hadn't made them in 40 years, and they were never meant to be sold to the public. They were designed for like surveillance purposes. And he said, "You know, if you want to buy them, I'll see how many we have." And so a couple of months later, he told me they had, I think it was 9.
Whoa.
And so we bought all 9 straight from Ingenue and rehoused them. And it wasn't just a matter of building new mechanics around them. We actually had to modify the rear optics to fit into a PL mount. And so we made a total of 15 of those and decided never to do them again.
Yeah, can you save one for me?
Yeah. They're all gone.
Yeah, you mentioned that your most loved lens is the wide angle from Nikon. So do you saw in person the 13, the original one, the 13 5.6, or no, it's just a legend? Yeah, because someone sort of at a priest, each time that they release one lens, comes a priest and blasts the lenses. Is that true? Yeah.
I haven't seen that one in person. I would love for someone to bring that to the shop and ask us to rehouse it.
Well, let's try to find one. Everyone here, please help, because this is something really tough to find. Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
That would be exciting.
And Pierre, how about you? What is your favorite? Do you have one?
No, it's different to name one, but no, it's really I have.
No problem. It's hard to choose. I understand.
Yeah, it's hard to choose. K35s, Zeiss super speeds, the Kowa sphericals. I really like them. Then the list goes on. It's
Right.
yes, it's for as a lens that I like really is the 28, which is not a very common, let's say, number, but 28 or because it's in between wide angle and normal, so you have the best of both worlds. But,
Yes. So
it.
guys, we have to start to finish, and I want to I have one more question, like in conclusion. What do you think we are going to be talking about it in maybe, I don't know, 5 years? What's the future trend for this vintage lenses rehouse thing?
I mean, I think the trend is just going to be that there are going to be so many options of different formats. I think you already have the Alexa 65, the Alexa LF, the area is supposed to be coming out with a 4K Super 35 camera. The Venice, you can flip from one format to another very easily, and I think there are going to be more cameras that just offer you pretty much any format you want to shoot with, and so at that point you can shoot with any glass that's out there, and you don't have to sort of limit yourself to what covers a full frame sensor or a Super 35 sensor, because the resolution will be there to satisfy any project, and you'll just it'll be difficult, I think, for people to find to pick one set of lenses, because the options will just be limitless at that point.
Yes. Pierre, Gabriel, do you want to make some final considerations? Or Alex, even something more if you want to?
Yeah, let me do it first so Pierre can finish it. Yeah. In my opinion, I think that the large formats will come, because the Super 35, it's pretty close to the full frame image, so we don't have that real immersion you can have, the experience you can have while it's seeing an image made by a medium format. I call medium format on a still camera, but when you have a large negative or large sensor like the 65. So I think, in my opinion, within the next 5 years, we may have some big cameras, maybe from Sony or Red or either I don't know. And of course, the film negative, I think that it will stay there forever. Yeah, that's my opinion. Yeah.
Yes, I think for myself also that the way we see things, it's not in a major way, but it will still exist. It's that we're gonna miss the small format, like 16 millimeters, and the lack of definition, and because this is not so easy to emulate after all. Our eyes are receiving so much sharp images that when we want to try to emulate organic image, or the population's eyes and view is getting so much, it's getting very critical. I see that I remember when the 5D, all these cameras, all the DSLR came out, we looked it at the first time and we were struck by it. We were, oh, this look exactly as 35 millimeter film cameras. And nowadays we look at it and we see right away it's not. And because so now I think maybe we're gonna try to go for 16 millimeter lenses and try small formats, because we want less definition, we want more other kind of aesthetics. And this is also really, really good, because for us as a cinematographer, I mean, the bigger palette of instruments, the better for cinema. So yes, I think we have to also look in the other way, not just more sensor, but maybe smaller sensors, or maybe back to small format film, or I don't know. That's what I think.
Nice. Thank you. Thank you, Alex, for being here. Such a pleasure.
Thank you.
Such an honor. Thank you, Pierre. Thank you, Gabriel.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks to everyone who has helped to make it happen. And that's it.
It was great talking. It was a real pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes,
Thank you
it
also
was.
for
Bye.
inviting me.
Vai. Para a galera que está assistindo, amanhã a gente tem o próximo webinar, que é com a Schneider, sobre filtros, e nas outras semanas teremos outros. E é isso, não percam. Muito obrigada.